And it allows us some flexibility around in terms of if there is a time where we have warmer weather and we're just not able to utilize all that amount. So we kind of have some cushion in there built in. The hedge percentages that we currently hedge are this upcoming season will be 50% of the annual requirements in year one. The second year is set at a max of 40%, and then the third year will be at 25%. And so our hedging program is flexible and it can be adjusted in response to changes in the market conditions. And every year we look at that, and every year we do tend to make some adjustments. This year we adjusted more in the outer years. So kind of as I mentioned, gas supply oversight committee does consider modifications, and that's exactly what we did in this year. And this is all built around our annual load expectations of about 35 million decatherms annually. And that's pretty consistent with recent history. Next. So this is a look at our transportation. And so Cascade holds transportation on 6 different pipelines. They're listed below: Enbridge, Williams, GTN, Nova, Foothills, and Ruby. And so we hold long-term capacity on these 6 pipelines. The in delivery on those pipelines is off of Enbridge, Williams, and GTN. And Williams being the primary one that we deliver off of, GTN would be the secondary, and then Enbridge is kind of the third, with the least volumes delivered off that pipeline. And then this is a look at our pipeline flow transport summary. And so it just gives you an idea of where the pipelines are located, our position on those pipelines in terms of how much transport we have and how much we flow. The vast majority, of course, is on Northwest Pipe. We flow most of it from Sumas South, so that's a big portion of our portfolio. And then we obviously have supply and transport in the Rockies that we flow north. The Opal across Ruby, we've utilized that during the winter for Central Oregon and GTN. And then we have the small amount from Station 2 down as well. So it just kind of gives you an idea of kind of all the locations across the system and the complexity of where we deliver to and from. This is just a quick look at our utilization from what we did from last winter. And this would be our demand from last winter of 2021. The top line is Northwest Pipe, and you can see it's kind of up and down over the winter. Sometimes we do have some late winter peaks like we had this last February. You can see there in the late February timeframe, we kind of had a peak in there. And then the next line down is our demand on GTN. And then below that would be our Enbridge. The Enbridge doesn't change as much just because given the profile there, it's in northwestern Washington. The weather doesn't fluctuate as much there, and there's a small core load. So it doesn't fluctuate quite as much as some of the other demand on the other pipelines. And then kind of given that transport that we looked at earlier, this is just a snapshot of our transport summary in terms of where we hold transport. And you can kind of see that the vast majority is held on Northwest Pipe and Sumas. And so that's kind of where most of our portfolio lies. We do have obviously transport in the Rockies, and then some at ACO, Kingsgate, and Station 2. And so what we do is we build our portfolio of supply around this transport and around the system demands. And then this was our supply summary by location from the 2021 season, just to give you an overall picture because we don't have everything from the 22-23 season yet. But this is kind of where we ended up. So once again, the vast majority of supply is at Hunt, at 57%. We utilize some of our Station 2 And then we kind of split up between Rocky, Wyoming, and Opal and the Rockies, and then some supply flowing south from ACO. So once again, it just kind of lines up with all of our transport that we had available. So this is a look at our storage resources that we have, and we have primarily three different accounts. So Jackson Prairie, we have 4 different accounts in Jackson Prairie. We hold about 1.2 BCF capacity there, and about 56,000 in withdrawal rights. And so last year we cycled about 99% of Jackson Prairie over the past winter season. And I would say that's pretty typical that we'd cycle around that 95 to 100%, depending upon the year. Plymouth is our liquid storage that we use. And so we typically use this more for peaking resources. And so it's a little bit chunkier in terms of how we use it. And so we have 2 accounts there, 662,200. But we do have that 78,125 decatherms of demand, which is very helpful during those peak periods. We can see our system go from 170 to 275,000 in a couple of days. And so with that shift in demand, it really helps to have that extra demand at Plymouth if we need it for those big peaking days that we have. Mist, which is in Western Washington and Oregon, in that side there, we can deliver off of the West Washington side. But this was added in 2019, and that added capacity in fall of 2021. We added some extra capacity late in the season that year.
Hey, Eric, we've got a couple questions in chat for you.
Oh, sure. Go ahead. Yep.
I've got one from Abe. He says, what are the units of those pie charts? So we might need to go back a slide.
Oh, they're all decatherms.
And then Byron says that the names don't seem to match the map. Could you explain what the charts are referring to?
So, the map. I guess you'd have to look back at the map. So in this, Opal, Wyoming, and Rocky Mountain Pool are all within the Rockies region. So there are specific market points. So all 3 of those are in the Rockies region. And so we place those at specific market points within the Rocky Mountain region. ACO is everything in Alberta. I just commonly refer to as ACO. Can be referred to as NIT as well. And so that would be everything that flows on from Nova and Foothills south. And then all the Hunt supply is Sumas. We typically just buy it on the Hunt side because of our direct connect across the border. Sumas is on the US side, Hunt is on the Canadian side. Technically, we buy it on the Canadian side, and then we transport it across the border. So that's why those don't seem to line up, just because the pipeline names are different than the market points and locations. Hopefully that helps. Okay, gotcha. Let's see where I was at. So with Mist, what we did is now we have 1.6 BCF of capacity and the 50,000 decatherms of demand, and that really helped us greatly in terms of operationally. That 50,000 decatherms of demand definitely plays a lot into our peak days. It does ratchet down over the winter, and so as we utilize more of that storage, those ratchets get lower and lower. But I'd say for kind of the peak demand season of that capacity, we try to hold that demand so we can meet those really peak days. And then so at 100% of demand, Cascade can meet approximately 67% of the peak day needs, which is quite a bit. So meaning that 67% of the peak day needs can be met through storage if we had total utilization of all of our demand capacity. And then total storage capacity accounts for about, like I said, about 14.75% of winter demand. And then the winter is 68% of the overall annual demand. So it gives you an idea of Cascade's load in the winter. Definitely much more demand and supply needed in the winter than over the summer. Next. So every year, what I do is I track our storage utilization through these storage utilization curves, and it just gives me an idea of where I need to be. And I kind of try to stay within 15 to 20% of the curve, just so I can tell where we're at, where we're utilizing our storage. And so this was a look at our 21-22 season. And so this curve starts at April 1 of 2021 through March 31 of 2022. And so it just gives me an idea of how we used our storage and kind of, to keep on track there. And then the min max there was only about a 5-year min max that I have in there. That's for Jackson Prairie. And then this was mist, and mist looks a little bit odd for 21-22, but as I mentioned, in the late fall of 2021, we added some capacity there, and so it does look a little odd in terms of how we did that. But as you can see, we tried to we had to add from that point where we added the extra capacity, so we had to ramp up our storage late in the season to make sure that account was filled. And then we utilized almost all of it, but we had just a little bit left at the end of the season there for mist. And this is our Plymouth storage. This once again is our liquid storage in Plymouth, Washington. And like I said, it's a little chunkier in terms of resources of how we use it. And it seems like typically we do end up using this a lot of times late in the season. I don't know why, but February, March sometimes can be challenging months if there's a cold spell. And we've used a lot of our storage out of mist and Jackson Prairie. Sometimes we have to kick in and use Plymouth storage. But you can see it's just kind of chunky in terms of how we use it. Typically, we'll just use it for these peak days. And sometimes those peak periods only last maybe a few days, and sometimes they last, up to a couple of weeks. So just depending upon kind of that peak demand time frame is how we use it. So we typically don't use it unless we absolutely have to for those purposes. So this is a look at our hedge calculation table. And so we keep track of this for every plan year. And then, as I mentioned in the past, in the first part of the presentation, is that we do adjust this annually, or we look at it annually to see if it needs adjusted. And so it just gives you an idea of where we're at from the start of the year, which is April 1, for start purchasing for contracts from November 1 of 2022 through October 31 of 2023. And so once again, as I mentioned, year 1, 80%, year 2, 60%, year 3, 25%. And then the actual hedge target that we have, which the hedge target is based upon the percentage of the need. And so we look at our forecasted annual usage and we plug that in, and then the needed base supply to meet that. And then we add in the hedge target, and then we take out the current hedge and the current indexed, and that kind of gives us the remaining amount to hedge for those years. So then when we look at the portfolio, we look at those amounts also monthly, and then we take our transport and demand needed, and when we plug in those contracts basically accordingly, so we can fill those gaps in the portfolio. So next. And then this is just a quick snapshot of our suppliers that we have. And so when we do our RFPs, we send out an RFP through a platform called Comet. And that's typically how we purchase a vast majority of our gas supply agreements. And so those suppliers come back with a proposal. And then so we base our need on those proposals. And so I would say that we typically have about 16 active, and some of those kind of fall in and out accordingly. Marketers change a bit, but there's some kind of really consistent ones that are that keep hanging in there and keep bidding. And so they're good suppliers to keep. And then kind of we have a lot of other ancillary ones around some of the primary ones that we deal with. So we have a pretty diverse portfolio in terms of the marketers that we use. And then this is just a kind of a side note on RNG, and this is kind of handled from our development group. But we were successful in an RFP for the Knott landfill located in Bend, Oregon. And so we do plan on, we don't have a contract in place yet, but we plan to basically try to get that contract in place so we can basically improve that gas quality to pipeline quality specifications and inject it into our pipeline. And so the business development team still works on that, and they're continually looking at RNG opportunities. And so that's kind of more down the line that we'll talk about RNG opportunities in Tag 4. So RNG is always considered a part of our portfolio, but we just don't have, we haven't quite got there yet, but it's still being worked on all the time.
We have a question about the size of the contract, and I'm not exactly sure we have that information at this
time. I don't.
Yeah,
I have no idea what that's going to be.
Yeah.
I would assume under 1,000 decatherms a day. That's the typical size of those, but I really don't know.
Yeah, we'll try and follow up on that, and we'll make sure to get those details out once we have them. We have another question. Would Cascade be owning this or purchasing from it? Do we have anyone with Cascade that could answer these? I'm not sure I know the answer to these questions yet.
Yeah, it's more on the business development side. I haven't.
Yeah, so I think some of this is with the business development side, and I don't see one from business development on the call. So we'll definitely follow up on that.
I might be able to help. I know we're what we're currently looking at for the Bend landfill is owning and operating facility.
Okay. Yeah. So it sounds like owning and operating is what we're looking at right now. But yeah, there'll definitely be more information coming out once that contract is in place. We can share more.
So a couple more things. This is just a look at our winter supply stack. And so obviously every year, like I said, it's a rolling portfolio. And so this is a kind of a look at what we'll have for the upcoming season. So we have our current supply that's stacked in there. And then obviously we have some needed RFPs that we have to add in for that year. And then we also account for some portion of our portfolio to be front of the month purchases, which we look at and evaluate monthly to determine how much we need for front of the month supply based upon current weather, current pipeline positions, those kinds of things. And then we also have that planned storage that we add in. So like I mentioned, about 14.75% of our kind of planned winter stack for storage. And then the next one, next slide is a look at.
Hey, Eric, we had a question. I didn't notice this at first, but are there supposed to be two different colors for these?
Yeah, and I don't know why that didn't come out. But weird. Yes, it doesn't show it, but yeah, it's I'd have to look again what the percentages are. But yes, there should be two different colors in there, so I did notice that. But yeah.
Yeah, when I post the presentation out on the website, I'll update this.
Okay.
Slide 19.
Yeah.
And fix
it. Yeah, and it is in there. So, but yeah.
Okay.
And then, so this is like just a peak day example that I throw in there, just to give you an idea of the resources that we would have available. And so we plan on that peak day around 275,000 decatherms. And I think we were in that range this last winter. I think we had a day that was maybe around that 280,000 decatherm range. And so this is kind of what we plan for, but as you can see, we have our current supply that we have, and then the RFP that we need for the winter. So here it does show the two colors. And then we can always add in front of the month spot gas. And I typically plan maybe for up to like 20,000 a day in front of the month spot gas. And then our JP storage utilization, our mist storage utilization, and then we can add in daily spot gas if we need to. I only put in 20,000. We can definitely do more than that if we have to. I've done up to 60 to 80,000 a day, depending upon the conditions. And then kind of the last stack would kind of be our Plymouth liquid storage that we had on there. So it just kind of tells you that we have more than enough resources to meet demand, but the kicker here is the JP and the mist. Those amounts can go down depending upon what time of year it is. And so it just varies, but this would be everything kind of at full capacity. But just gives you a good idea of, we do have plenty of resources available to meet those peak days. That's kind of all I had, unless somebody else has other questions.
Yeah, if anyone has questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask or write some more questions in the chat. But if there are no more questions, we'll move to thanks to Eric for.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate it.
We'll move on to the Plexos optimization modeling. Anyone that's not familiar with Plexos, this is the new upstream optimization model that we've contracted with. Energy Exemplar is the company. This is to replace our old optimization model called Sendout. Plexos is a much newer version of it. Sendout was getting pretty old. It hadn't seen some updates in a few years. And it also didn't allow us to model for emissions. So there were no emission constraints in Sendout, which Plexos does have that capability. So the two main reasons for picking up Plexos was that it was a much newer and updated version. And they have a lot of designated people on the Plexos side to make updates, work with us to fine tune their model in ways that can help us. So it is a resource optimization model. It permits the company develop and analyze a variety of resource portfolios to help determine the type, size, and timing of resources best matched to forecast requirements. It's a very powerful and complex tool. So it operates by combining a series of existing and potential demand side and supply side resources, and it optimizes it at the lowest net present cost over the entire planning period for given demand and demand side resources and hitting emissions constraints. So we see the new IRP process is not only least cost, least risk, but also meeting decarbonization targets. This is a little note from the Plexos website. It's a unified energy modeling and forecasting software platform. Feel free to go out there. I provided a link. You can go check out Energy Exemplar. They also have, oh man, I'm blanking on the name. They have an upstream optimization model for electric as well, but Plexos is the one for natural gas. One thing to remember about Plexos, though, it is a very powerful and complex tool. It has perfect information, so it knows when we put the demand forecast in out to 2050. Yes, Aurora is the name. Thank you, Devin. So it's a very powerful tool. It knows the demand forecast out to 2050. It knows the price forecast out to 2050. Obviously, the price forecast in 2050 is going to be wrong. So Plexos has that perfect knowledge. So we have to keep that in mind when we analyze the results of it. So modeling challenges. Supply needs to get gas to the city. It's kind of silly, but if I drew a map of our transportation from supply to storage to city gates, it's very complex. It's very difficult to understand. There's a lot of transportation contracts, a lot of storage contracts. So it is a modeling challenge. We have a great team that gets together and runs through all these contracts to make sure they're put in correctly. Many of Cascade's transport agreements were entered into decades ago, so we're always communicating with the pipelines. Hey, does this contract still make sense? Can we combine these contracts? So making sure that we're always up to date, that's a modeling challenge. Some of receipt quantity and aggregate delivery quantity can help identify resource deficiencies depending on how rights are allocated. This kind of goes along with the next bullet point as well. The aggregated look can mask individual city gate issues for loop sections, and the disaggregated look can create deficiencies where they don't exist. So we have, and we'll go into more detail with transportation contracts, but we have transportation contracts that can go to multiple locations and serve multiple areas. Well, if it's going to one location, it may have a deficiency in another location, but it could also flip based on if the costs are the same. So we have to make sure that we're paying attention, that we're putting in incremental transports that make sense. We could put an increment, even if there's a deficiency in Central Washington, we could put an incremental transportation contract in Western Washington, and it might solve that deficiency in Central Washington. So that's something we have to keep in mind. In many cases, operational capacity is greater than contracted. Supply, storage, and upstream transportation focuses on the core. The non-core, they purchase their own supply and they purchase their own transportation. So we don't have to focus on them for that piece of the Plexos modeling, but we do have to incorporate them for the emissions modeling. So they are part of the Plexos model. And then again, Plexos is perfect knowledge. We have to remember that when we analyze the results, we have to make sure that everything actually makes sense, and that it's not modeling and operation are very different. So we have to make sure that it does make sense. So I'm going to jump into some of the base case inputs. So we'll go through demand, supply, price forecast, storage, transportation, constraints, and emissions. So demand behind the city gate. If anyone is interested in hearing more about the demand and the demand forecast, please see our website for tag 2 information. The presentations out there, videos out there, you can reach out for questions. That's where our demand data comes from for this, for our modeling. We strived over the last several years to enhance the IRP forecast to analyze it at a granular level. That way we can get it to our zones that we have on Northwest Pipeline, our city gates that we have on GTN. Oops, sorry. It definitely is a challenge. We have customer billing data. It doesn't come in at the daily level. So a lot of the upstream modeling is based on peak day. And so it's really good to have daily information. We can get some information from the pipelines that have daily data, but we also have to combine it with our billing data. That way we know how it's allocated in terms of rig schedules and core and non-core. Some towns can be served by multiple pipelines, and the mix can change over time. And yeah, check out our website if you want more information on Tag 2. So demand is forecasted at the city gate level and by rate schedule, but for Plexos modeling, we roll those up just to make it a little simpler in Plexos. If you have it so complex, the run times take forever. So we try and roll up where we can. Since Northwest Pipeline allows us to allocate our upstream transportation MDQs within a zone, we roll them up to the zonal level. GTN, it's a little more difficult. We have to model them at the city gate demand, the city gate location. So the inputs, we forecast our models in R, and then we input them, the results, the daily results, into Plexos. Its projected usage from 23 to 2050. And then for the base case, DSM is not input into the base case. We run the base case. We look where we have any transportation issues. This allows us to gather information for our avoided cost. Our avoided cost is run, which we'll discuss later in this presentation. And then that's provided to our energy efficiency group here in Washington, Monica's group, and they run their analysis and load map, and they provide projected therm savings that we can input into our model. And this is a competing resource for those other traditional supplies. The geologic gas, RNG, competes against storage, all that stuff. And then DSM is treated as a decrement to demand in Plexos. So we can put that in as a DSM value, and it just decrements demand at the zone or at the city gate. So just to break up the presentation a little bit, to throw in some pictures, give everyone a little bit of an insight on Plexos. This top one is send out. That's how it looked in the older version. Since we started allocating these or rolling up these residential commercial into the zones. So you see the zone, the blue on the Plexos one, that is the node, and where with the hand and the fire, that's where the end use is. That's where the customers are at. And then this is kind of how it looks inside of in Plexos. You have up here, it tells you like the gas DSM program. It tells you what it's connected to. These are the properties. So demand type is an input. This is our demand. If there's a shortage, it's going to charge us a lot of money. So this forces it to not have a shortage. In this excess price, this is just a default number that it puts in. This is just if you force it if you force a constraint to make this overtake or take excess gas, it'll give some money back. But we don't have to worry about that because we don't force any constraints that fall under this. So just to touch on supply again, this is a image from one of Eric's presentations. I will add from what Eric said, these are current numbers. In 2023, we're currently expected, towards the end of 2023, we're currently expected to pick up 20,000 on NGTL and GTN and 10,000 on foothills. The reason for that is we need more transport on GTN to meet our Central Oregon demand. we picked up extra on NGTL and foothills. That way we can get closer to matching these numbers and to get to closer to this GTM number. So how do we model supply? Well, we model at 4 markets: ACO, Sumas, Kingsgate, and Opal. At each market, Cascade can purchase gas at different locations along the pipeline. For the first year, we try to use all of our current contracts that we have in place. That way it gives us an accurate look at the first year. But after that, we don't have long-term contracts out to 2050, so we have to put something in to kind of simulate buying contracts. So what we do is we have base, we have fixed, winter base, summer, winter day gas, and then peak day. But I'll go through each of those just to kind of break it down. And then over the planning horizon, these contracts are renewed in November and April. And this is how it looks. This is send out on the left, ACO receipt. On the right, you see ACO receipt, and it's being transported down to ABC. So that's the Alberta, British Columbia location. So supply base and fixed are the baseline supply contracts that are entered into every 12 months. So these are our long-term base contracts that we purchase that serve our base load demand. It has a basis rate. This is defined as the price of gas at a given market. A fixed contract has a fixed rate, and then a penalty is applied. So to force it to only take what it absolutely needs, we apply a penalty to it. If it doesn't take, if it contracts for, let's say, 20,000, but on a day it only takes 19,000. So these, we have a question: how big of penalties are we talking? Do these impact ratepayers? No. So these are kind of it's kind of a modeling technique to force us to force the model to take this base gas and only take the base gas. This doesn't really have an impact on rates, and I believe we price it at the same price as the cost of gas. So whether it takes the gas or it doesn't, it's going to pay that same price. But that one's more for a modeling technique to make sure it takes what it needs. Only takes what it needs. Only contracts for what it needs, rather. So you can see here, this is a better image of what we see in Plexos. You can see it's connected to the gas node. We're selecting properties. Here it breaks out the properties. So if we, let's say, expansion optimality, we don't want to use that at all for any of our gas contracts, we can go into the settings and remove that, and it won't show up here. But you can see here, contract type, this is a base contract, ACO index. Quantity day, it connects to a data file. This is a CSV file where we have all of our child objects, or our ACO index, our SUMAS index, all of our gas supply contracts, and it has the supply MDQ that we allow it to take. Here's the price. The price is $0 plus ACO. So the ACO is just, like I mentioned on the previous slide, it's NYMEX minus or plus the ACO basis. And then the renomination start period. So like I mentioned, we renominate, or RMIX is the send out term. So every November 1st, it takes a look at the next year, and it says how much base gas do we need, and let's contract for that. So base supply. So here's kind of a graph. This is a very simple version of looking at demand. This is using normal weather. We inserted some peak weather, and then we went back to normal weather. Most likely it'll be in real life, in actuality, it'll be much more jagged than this. But you can see the base supply, it just takes the absolute minimum for the entire year. So winter base supply, this is it's similar to base supply, but it's for the winter months, November to, I want to say, end of March. It has a slight premium compared to base gas, just because winter gas is generally more expensive than summer gas. MDQ is optimally set by Plexos, so we let it renominate. So Plexos decides how much gas it takes. Winter supply is renewed every November and completes at the end of March. Winter supply is additional baseline supply on top of the base or fixed. There is a penalty, just like the other one. That way it forces it to take that way it forces it to take the minimum optimal amount. And you can see here for these months, November to beginning of April, end of March, it's going to take the minimum point. So now we still have to fill in the rest of this with other types of gas. We have day supply for winter. It's going to be a little more expensive. It takes into account the fixed and variable costs of resources. It has an MDQ cap. So, for example, if it has an MDQ cap of 10,000, it can take anywhere from 0 to 10,000 on any day. So there's no penalty on this day supply gas. This is like front of month gas or day gas that Eric would go out and purchase. And you can see here in the yellow dot, it kind of follows this, but it's also capped out, so it can't purchase on these peak day. We also have this for summer, set up the same way. It's a little more expensive again, just because it's day gas and it's not contracted earlier. And it's capped at 10,000, purchase anywhere from 0 to 10,000. You can see here. So we have a question. If base supply is the cheapest, would it be possible to have an annual sinusoidal base supply that more closely matches the demand curve? So the reason why we modeled like this is because we do have long-term contracts. We have annual contracts. And that's what those are trying to simulate. I'll have to think about your question a little more. I don't know if Eric has anything to add, or Devin or Ashton.
So I can kind of chime in with a thought about this.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just realized I'm echoing and that's really throwing me off. The base, so in a perfect world, you would want to have kind of a base supply that would kind of match what the curve would be. So it would follow that sinusoidal curve that we do see in demand. But a couple of things. First of all, those base supply contracts are annual contracts. So in order to get, presumably, let's say it was a fixed price deal, right? You're going to get a discount on the summer months to compensate for the fact that you're paying the same price over annualized, levelized over the 12-month period. It's also, you want to have it as a kind of flatline base supply. That's what you think is the lowest your demand will be, for some of the reasons that Brian talked about. You want to leave some room for variance based on the variable nature of what load will ultimately be. If we knew exactly what weather was going to be and exactly what load would be, what you're saying may make sense. But because we don't know, ultimately, there may be higher than expected weather, or probably more dire, I would say there may be warmer than expected weather. to the point where we would oversupply if we were to try to exactly perfectly match what the demand curve would be. So we want to leave room to be able to make those day purchase acquisitions or even those winter only purchase acquisitions that Brian's talking about, so that we already have kind of a base allocation taken care of what we think is the lowest possible amount of demand would be. So we wouldn't be oversupplied and thus buying gas that we have nothing to do with. And ultimately that would be to the detriment of our ratepayers and our customers. But we want to make sure we cover that baseline, and then we can make almost, if you think about it, as tactical purchases during the summer and winter months, during even day-to-day periods, to account for those unexpected and unpredictable fluctuations in weather and other factors that may create the uncertainty in demand. Hope that answers the question, Byron.
Sort of. I mean, like, it sounds like there's the biggest thing is more just the complications around contracting. Like, I imagine it'd be very, very frustrating to go to someone you're buying it from and say, okay, we want this sinusoidal function over the year. I imagine that's probably the more complicating factor than just simply having a demand estimate and then getting a base load that's 80% or like 85% below your demand estimate. So
yeah, I'll defer a little bit to Eric on that, but I would imagine that suppliers typically like to have, if you're entering into a contract with us, it's going to be for X decatherms per day, and that's not going to vary over the course of the month. Could you theoretically enter into a bunch of contracts that maybe follow that sinusoidal pattern? Sure, but I would agree with that statement that it would probably be difficult from a purchasing perspective. And like I said, I actually do think there is it's important credence to the fact that one of the worst things that could happen would be to be especially significantly oversupplied. And that gets back to that chart that Eric was talking about, that we only try to target to make purchases for X amounts contracted. So we do have that tactical ability to act when demand does what we don't expect. So I think it's a function of both those factors.
Okay, thanks.
No worries.
Yeah, I think so. So this graph right here, you can see the red dots, that shows the summer day, and you can see that it's capped out. Peak supply, this is on those peak days where gas is really high, whether it's cold weather, whether you're on a shoulder month. It has a slightly higher premium. We would expect gas to be more expensive on really cold days. And as long as Cascade has transport capacity or can utilize third-party transportation capacity, we can purchase as much peak supply as needed to meet that peak demand. And so you can see on here in the blue, that's the peak day demand supply. You can also see in these shoulder months, these are the months where our winter months and our summer months connect, but there's still some cold weather coming in those months. I think we had snow in April this year, so you can see that we could still have some peak weather come in April and late October. So for storage, just to retouch on these a little bit, we have 3 locations: Jackson Prairie, Plymouth Mist. We have 4 storage contracts with JP, 2 with Plymouth and 2 with Mist, although it's going to go to 1 combined contract in 2024. So that was also a modeling challenge, modeling the 2 Mist contracts combining into 1. Storage injection targets for JP are set at 35% by June, 80% by August, and 100% by September. We also have withdrawal ratchets. So like Eric was mentioning, depending on the time of the year, our withdrawal rights might be less than our maximum withdrawal right. So we have to put those storage ratchets in. So say we're at 60% storage, maybe we only get 90% of our withdrawal right. So we put that in. Plexos knows, okay, if our maximum inventory is at this level, this is how much we can withdraw. It takes that maximum withdrawal, multiplies by that ratchet percentage, and that's what it can withdraw. So we have all of our withdrawal ratchets in set up in Plexos. Storage example, so some pictures. This is send out on the left, Plexos on the right. You can see the transportation contracts coming in. We have this node called Jackson Prairie Interconnect, JPIC. That's where we connect the storage facilities, JP1, JP2, JP3, JP4, those 4 contracts. And then once you can inject it, and then you can withdraw it, and you can send it back out on those transportation contracts. So you can see here, this is what we see. You can see it's connected to Plymouth Interconnect. We have a max volume amount. That's the maximum inventory volume. We have withdrawal charge, injection charge, reservation charge. These numbers are usually negotiated numbers. That's why I blocked it out. And then we have fixed, and you can see a couple of these are tied to data files. So these are CSV files that we connect to Plexos. And then maximum withdrawal, max injection day. You can see that when they run. So from months 11 to 12 and 1 to 3, we have withdrawal rights. And then months 4 through 10, we don't have any withdrawal rights. And then if you keep going down, you'll see withdrawal ratchets that I discussed on the previous slide. Are there any questions on supply or storage or demand? Okay. Not seeing any other questions, so we'll jump into transportation. These are the means of how Cascade gets gas from supplier to end user. It may stop in storage for a while, but we need transportation contracts to move that gas. We have contracts that have single delivery points, so we receive it here, we deliver it there. Or we can have multiple delivery points, so it can go to a zone in Western Washington, or it can go to a zone in Central Washington. Or even down to Eastern Oregon. So the multiple delivery point contracts gives us flexibility to move gas where it's most needed. And again, Northwest Pipe, it's at the zonal level, GTN, we're at the city level. And I'll show a map of what I mean by zonal level, just to give a better idea of what we mean there on Northwest Pipe. That'll be in a few slides. So transportation, we have an MDQ, a D1 rate, a transportation rate, and a fuel loss. So MDQ is the maximum amount of gas Cascade can deliver on a single day. So if it's 10,000 decatherms, that means we can purchase 10,000 decatherms and we can move 10,000 decatherms. There will be a little bit of a fuel loss percentage for lost and unaccounted for. That's that last bullet point. So it may be like 9,999 decatherms, but it's up there. A D1 rate, this is the reservation rate. This is like paying rent to the Northwest Pipe, to the pipelines, Northwest Pipe, GTN. If it's 10,000 decatherms a day, we pay this rent every day of the year to have that reservation. We can use that when we need it. The transportation rate, that's when we actually flow on it. If we flow 5,000 decatherms on a day, we're going to pay for 5,000 decatherms plus that reservation rate. And then the fuel loss percentage. This is a statutory percentage from the pipeline's tariffs. So we just pull from there, put it into Plexos. So here's what transportation looks like in send down Plexos. You can see it just connects and it has arrows. Before in send out, it would have arrows at the interconnect. Now here they're in the middle and they point to which direction it's going. So you can see these pipelines are going from ABC to Cascade. So here's transportation example. You can see in this top left part, this is Foothills, one of our Foothills contracts. It goes from ABC to Cascade. So you can see the gas node from and the gas node to. And then here are the properties. So all the properties here are tied to a CSV. We go into, whenever there's an update, let's say that there's a rate case and we get new rates on our transportation contracts, we go in and update these files to reflect the correct rates. So you can see MDQ, that's maximum delivery quantity, flow charge. So that's a little bit of a tricky thing with Plexos. There's some new terminology. Flow charge is the same thing as the transportation charge. Whatever you transport or whatever you flow, that's where you're charged. Reservation volume, reservation charge, that's what you're paying, the dollar per decatherm that you're paying for rent on the pipelines, and then the volume of that charge, and then the loss rate. So delivery rights versus receipt rights. So receipt rights, that is what you can receive from, so let's say the marketer, so let's say Sumas. We can receive gas at Sumas, and delivery rights, that's what we deliver to our zones. So let's say actually I have an example in a few slides, but we have 457,000 delivery rights, but we only have 360,000 decatherms of receipt rights. That's not necessarily a bad thing or anything. It's actually, I see it as a good thing. It's a very good flexible way for us to distribute our 360,000 decatherms. So we can receive 360,000 decatherms a day, and we can deliver that 457,000 different ways. Basically, that's one way to think about it. So here's an example of a flexible contract. So in this example, it's 4,000 decatherms a day. It goes from Sumas to these three made-up locations. So it can send 4,000 decatherms to location X1 up to 4,000. So anything less than that, it can do. X2, same thing. X3, same thing. The only thing that we have to keep in mind is the sum of all three of those also have to be below 4,000. So we set that up into Plexos. That way we're not using these inflexible methods to model. If we didn't have that constraint functionality in Plexos, we would have to set it up like this. So send 2.5 decatherms here, 1 here. So we would have to pick and choose where that goes. So it's really nice having that functionality in Plexos to constrain the models. It's not too difficult to set it up. You just have to make sure you have all the contracts that are included in this constraint and make sure that the decatherms are set up correctly. So to simplify modeling in Plexos, the software allows the user group multiple paths of one contract into a constraint group. This tells Plexos to allow each path to take up to X decatherms, but not to exceed X decatherms for all paths. The analyst identifies which contract should be in the group and assigns the MDQ for the constraint group. So you can see here, this is constraint group 100302 STN. The contracts that are inside of that constraint group are these three in the gas pipelines area. And so here we say right-hand side day. That's just the terminology inside of Plexos, but this is essentially saying, for example, 10,000 decatherms. So each of these can flow 10,000 decatherms, but the total for each day can only be 10,000 hectares. So that's how a constraint works in Plexos. So here's the zones. So you can see, I'll start here, Eastern Oregon. We have some city gates, Baker City, Ontario, NISA. I think this is a Baker compressor station, all the way up to the Meacham station. These are usually broken out by compressor stations. So this whole area right here would be zone 24. As long as we have delivery rights to, let's say, Baker, we can also reallocate those to some of the other locations, as long as they're within the same zone. So in me, Oregon, this is this north central Oregon, where we have Pendleton, Umatilla, Hermiston. We also have this little point right here, zone me, Washington would be Walla Walla. You go up to the Tri-Cities into Moses Lake, Othello, that's where you have zone 20. When you go up, I think this is I-82, up through Toppenish, Grandview, your zone 10, up into Wenatchee, zone 11. Coming across the gorge and up Western Washington, the I-5 corridor, we have some capacity here in Longview. This would be zone 26. And then we have zone 30S, which is the Bremerton, Shelton, Hoquiam area. And then if you keep going further north, you're in the Bellingham area, that's zone 30W. So as long as we can get the contracts themselves, the transportation contracts, they'll usually say receipt of SUMIS, delivery of, let's just, for example, Longview Kelso. And so we could put it to Longview Kelso, but we cannot send it to any city gate within the zone 26. So emissions, we do include emissions in our modeling as a constraint. These are based on the Climate Commitment Act in Washington and the Climate Protection Program in Oregon. And what Plexos has to do is it must purchase carbon offsets, renewable gas, traditional gas to meet demand while also hitting these emissions reduction targets. So for example, 2025, it's going to go out and it's going to buy traditional gas. And then it's going to look at the carbon emissions and say, what do we need to do to offset our targets on a least cost, least risk basis. So it goes out and looks at carbon offsets, looks at renewable gas, and then it hits those targets. So it's really nice having that flexibility. Yeah, so I don't want to jump. We have a question in chat. Can you discuss the types of offsets Cascade is looking for its model? I know we're going to discuss a lot of that at Tag 4, so I don't want to go into too much detail. But we do have, and I can go into the next slide, but we call them CCIs in Plexos. I know Oregon has a different terminology than what Washington does. But we will be discussing those further in Tag 4. And I'm trying to, I know we use Climate Commitment Act or Climate Commitment Investments. Is that what they're called in Oregon?
Community climate investments.
That's right, community. And I don't know what we're calling them in Washington.
So in Washington, they're technically just offsets. And as Brian said, we'll go into a lot more detail about it, but we're not specifically quantifying how we would look at the offsets. I think that's a little bit too micro for the kind of more macro IRP planning. But it's basically that constraints provided in the Climate Commitment Act from a Washington perspective that I think it's something like 8%, half of which would be tribal land based in the first period. 6% and then 4%. I don't, or maybe 5%. I don't remember off the top of my head, but whatever the constraint is as detailed in the act, we're kind of doing it as a non-quantified, non-specified, but a general utilization of that provision in the Climate Commitment Act, with the dollar allocation being at the social cost of carbon.
Yeah, thanks, Devin.
Yeah.
Oh, so you guys are using the social cost of carbon to model the offsets and not, say, using like projected costs. So for example, like in California, their cap and trade program is kind of different than the social cost of carbon.
Right.
Can you guys kind of speak to, I guess, the rationale for that assumption?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what we're talking about is two different vehicles as described in the Climate Commitment Act. So there's the, and I'm gonna try really hard not to mess this up, and we're, like Brian said, we'll talk about it more in the next one. But there's the allowance vehicle and the offset vehicle. The allowance vehicle is more of that auction program that you're talking about. Preliminarily, when we first looked at it, because we didn't have the full Climate Commitment Act rule, one assumption we had made was that the number of allowances that would be available would basically be what all of us as players in the market, so the Cascades, the Avistas, the other entities that were under compliance, would put forward what they'd be required to allocate into that auction. And as a modeling assumption, because we didn't want to assume, let's say we assume that we're going to start buying other people's allowances, and then everybody else makes the same assumption, all of a sudden there's too much demand for not enough allowances. So for that specific vehicle, that auction vehicle, and once again, this assumption was made prior to the most recent iteration of the rules coming out, so we may be revising it based on some new information that was in there. But at this point, our modeling perspective was that the allowances themselves would be looked at as a wash, right? So we would be given our allowances from ecology, I believe it is, or DEQ, I forget. So we'd be giving our allowances, and then we would have to send it to the market, and then we would buy back what we sent, presumably at a net even cost to ratepayers. So that aspect we assume to be a zero-sum game, that we just assume no impact. Then there's a second provision in the CCA for offsets, and that specific provision is more so you invest in carbon capture technologies, for instance, or I don't want to get into the details. It's, I think, definitely way too much in the woods, but there are certain programs that you can invest in, potentially even non-quantified programs at this point, for a separate vehicle from that auction that you're talking about, which is going to be based on probably similar to the California system, and the CCA provides even what some price floors and price ceilings for that auction would be. But this is a separate vehicle, has to do with investing in community programs towards reducing one specific metric ton of CO2 equivalent. And I think, I don't want to be quoted on this, but I think that somewhere in the law, it says that, or it may have been discussed, that the essential cost of doing that, it's for every dollar you invest in this equal to the social cost of carbon. So every dollars equal to the social cost of carbon, you would get credit for 1 metric ton. Just to use a large scale example, let's say you invested $1 million in planting trees all across Washington. And let's say that was a qualified program. You would take that $1 million divided by the social cost of carbon, and that's how many offset credits you would get for that specific program. At least that's the understanding we were modeling with at this time. And so once again, that's a separate vehicle altogether from the auction, which, based on our understanding at the time when we made some of these assumptions, we assumed would not have a greater than zero impact on our emissions compliance availability, the tools availability. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it's something that we might have to like come back to. I think probably at the next tag.
Definitely. I think there's room for a very robust discussion about it in the next tag. And we're still, It's a little bit challenging for us, kind of getting back to one of the principles that Brian has talked about often. The challenge of IRP modeling is when we're in a very dynamic rules environment and rules kind of come down the pipe that could change the game. It's at what point are you too far into your efforts that it would be time prohibitive, cost prohibitive, and just too difficult to incorporate new information in. However, there is some valuable information that we may end up still wanting to incorporate in. And so once again, the past perspective, the perspective we had from following some of the CCA meetings that were going on in Washington, kind of led us to believe that the results of those auctions would be a zero-sum game that we wouldn't be able to benefit off of, or it would be dangerous to want to model benefiting off of. However, the new guidance has come across as the newest draft rules have let us know that it's not in fact a zero-sum game, and that the powers that be have the ability to introduce additional uh, allowances into the marketplace if the demand is there for them. And once again, I'm not fully read up on the rules, so I don't want to speak out of turn about that. But that new factor theoretically could potentially allow us to have the ability to add that as a secondary resource or an additional resource besides just the offsets. From a conservative modeling perspective, I think it would probably be safest to assume that those should be priced at the price ceiling, which is probably what we would end up doing if we were to do something like incorporating that as an additional resource. But even at that price ceiling, it would be cheaper than the social cost of carbon when scaled up into real 2021 dollars. So it's interesting. It's definitely, I agree. I think it's something that we're going to want to flesh out a little bit more, and we'll bring information to be prepared to discuss it with you and all stakeholders at the next TAG meeting.
Yep. All right, thank you, Devin, and thank you, Byron, for the question. So here's, I think I only have a couple more slides left, and then we'll take a quick break. So here's an emissions example. You can see all the gas nodes that we include. We do the emissions at nodes, because if you do it at the demand location, then you can't serve RNG to it, or else it would be considered it would be tied to an emission at that node. So we have to put emissions at these traditional nodes. You can see Washington CCIs are in here. But we have two emissions here. One of them is if we want to run a scenario without emissions included. So there's extra stuff over here that says scenario. So we would just toggle on which scenario to run. But with emissions, you can see we have a data file, CSV file of CO2e limits, and then add all these nodes where there's emissions. We put an emission value to it of pounds per MMBTU, and then you can do carbon offsets that you go and purchase for a certain price, and it'll offset your emissions at a pound per decatherm. Great. So yeah, this is the last slide for the base case Plexos modeling. Are there any questions about Plexos? We'll have some preliminary results of our Plexos model runs in tag 4. Okay. I'm not seeing any questions, so what we'll do is we'll take a quick 5-minute break. Everyone can use the restrooms or fill up some water, and we'll be back at 10:35. All right, it's 10:35, so we'll get back to the presentation. Well, we'll be jumping around between the resource planning team these next few slides. So this right here, this is our supply resource optimization process flowchart. This is kind of the flow we try to use to analyze different portfolios, different scenarios. That way we can get down to a preferred portfolio. And I'm going to jump into these next slides. It's kind of just gives you an image, shows you where we input base data, some incremental data, some where we input weather simulations, price simulations, any gas bands, price impacts, and kind of our decision making. When we move from one to the next, we ask ourselves questions about the portfolios. If the answer is yes, we may have to go back. If the answer is no, maybe we can move forward with the portfolio. So these next slides, these will talk about the steps. So step one, what we do is we model our as is. So we just look at what we have as our existing resources. And we look at it deterministically, what our expected, so deterministic is our expected weather, our expected price, our expected demand of the existing resources to uncover timing and quantity of deficiency resources. So one process we use in this as is we modeled without emissions constraints. That way we could see what transportation constraints we have on our system. And we did identify a few which we were able to incorporate into we'll put it into our narrative that we have these constraints on transportation, and then we'll show how to solve that through these next steps. So we identify portfolios that we have 6 different portfolios of incremental resources. This includes various mix of incremental resources, including transportation, RNG, hydrogen, DSM, offsets. And then step 3, we analyze these portfolios. Each portfolio will be run through the Plexos optimizer under expected conditions. So it's under the base case. It's evaluated under deterministic and stochastic weather pricing. So stochastic is that Monte Carlo analysis that we do. And the timing quantity, if applicable, of unserved demand and emissions reduction shortfalls will be recorded. And then Cascade will also record the risk-adjusted total system of each portfolio. And that risk-adjusted is, it takes part of the deterministic run and parts of the stochastic and merges those together to get a risk-adjusted total system cost. So then we rank the portfolio. So after we run these portfolios, we see what comes out with the lowest risk and the lowest risk-adjusted total system cost, that is. And that becomes our top ranked portfolio. The second one becomes our next ranked portfolio. And the way we rank these is based on that total system cost, but also we want to make sure we hit demand. If we're not serving customers, we're not hitting our core responsibility. And so we want to make sure we hit that demand and we serve our customers, but we also want to keep in mind that we're trying to hit these emission reduction targets. So those are the ways that we rank those portfolios. And then for step 5, we're going to do some scenario analysis. We want to stress test these portfolios to make sure under under different conditions, do we still like these portfolios? So we'll provide scenario and sensitivity testing on customer growth, energy efficiency. We'll limit some of the RNG supply, our hydrogen supply. We'll put in some natural gas bans, and we'll do some stochastic analysis on pricing. And so we run these and we evaluate them deterministically and stochastically. And then I'll take a step back at the, oh no, it's after the next one, sorry. So then we jump to step 6. We evaluate the candidate portfolio. So we take a look at how it performed qualitatively and quantitatively at all of these, or at the top ranked candidate portfolio. So we'll run the top ranked candidate portfolio first. If we see any issues that we're concerned about, we'll have to take a look at it and see if it makes sense. If it does make sense and we do have a legit concern about that portfolio, we'll go back to step 5 and we'll look at a different portfolio, that second ranked portfolio. And we'll run that through the scenario analysis. So those are basically our supply resource optimization process. If we don't find any concerns and we like how it performed under step 6, we'll move forward with it as our preferred portfolio. Just some additional preferred portfolio considerations we have to keep in mind. Do we get all the supply to the city gates? Is it reliable? So in the past, we've had a resource that showed that it was cost effective. It was least cost, but it also had a history of not being very reliable. So we had to take a qualitative look at it and determine if it was something that we wanted to, if we wanted to move forward with it, we would increase our risk. And so we had to take a qualitative look at that. Does it have a long lead time? Do these projects, if we have to get a project, what's the lead time on it? How much does it cost? And some of these are already built into Plexos, but it's something that we definitely have to consider. Is it a new build, or does it have depreciated cost to it? Rate pancakes. This is where we pick up upstream transportation. So let's say we need some ACO gas. Well, we have to pay a rate on Nova, and then we have to pay a different rate on Foothills, and then we have to pay a different rate on GTN. And then if GTN and Northwest Pipe, you can transport gas from one pipeline to the other. So there's another rate pancake if you move it onto Northwest Pipeline. So those are things we have to keep in consideration. Is this resource base load or peak load? How many decatherms are needed? So what does our shortfall look like? What is the shape of the resource? Is the resource just, if it's a supply resource, is it flat? Does it have only flat load that it can supply, or does it have a shower in the winter and less in the summer? Is this a tried and true technology, new technology, or yet to be discovered? And then who else will be competing for the resource? So we have to keep that in mind when we're modeling RNG, hydrogen. We do look at potential RNG, hydrogen for the Pacific Northwest, and we do look at our share compared to other LDCs in the region. That way we have an expectation of what we are competing for and what we can get. So are there any questions with this process that I just discussed? Any other thoughts? Okay, I think I'm kicking it over to Devin.
Actually, Brian,
Yes,
it's
go ahead.
Kim. I do have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
And maybe we'll hear more about this later, but in terms of the technology side of things, are you envisioning having, recognizing that, I think we're in a space where really having to consider a lot of new technologies and new approaches, leveraging any kind of standardization around determining readiness levels. So the things that come to mind, are obviously technology readiness levels, but other things like commercial readiness levels. But do you envision an approach to do that, so hybrid sort of qualitative, quantitative analysis of that readiness level for new technologies?
Yeah, definitely. So I don't know if I'd call it new technology, but it's new to Cascade, where we look at RNG, and so RNG is kind of new to us. It's not new to the industry. So when we look at that, we kind of look at what is actually out there, what our business development group is in talks with, and what we're close to contracting with, and we try and model that as being more ready. But then we have some stuff out in the future that is a little more broad. We're not exactly sure how we're going to get it, but we know it's out there, and we could get it if we needed to. And there's also some, I don't know about any other technology other than that RNG and hydrogen. But if there was some other technology that came on, yeah, we would definitely have to look at the readiness of it to put it onto our system.
Sure. And I guess, I don't know that it would come up here specifically, but certainly around, as you consider energy efficiency, making sure that like those technology readiness levels and commercial readiness levels are considered. But I find myself wondering, I know there's a lot of question about how to translate the studies and the potential for RNG and availability, and especially, in a place where you're competing for it with other utilities, but combining that with the commercial readiness, and by that I specifically have in mind what might be an outdated idea, that of the levels that ARPA-E had assembled for commercial readiness that helps sort of articulate, okay, well, they've accomplished this level of scaling of this particular product, or it's commercially available, whatever. And I don't know if it applies, but I find myself sort of looking for some kind of structure for consideration of that availability of even new RNG in terms of its presence and availability in the market.
I can jump in a little bit, Brian, if you want.
Yeah.
Because I actually think this will lead into what I'm going to talk about next. It's just going to be some of the conversation about some of the scenarios that we're planning on running, because I think it's a fascinating conversation about we're looking at so much speculative, futuristic, advanced technologies, and how do you properly prepare for that and account for that? And I think that's what the scenario analysis is hopefully going to help us at least get a little bit of a picture of. Is the ones that come to mind off my head right away is kind of like Brian said about RNG, but specifically green hydrogen. I think that's a fascinating technology that it's, there's so much debate out there and speculation. I know Northwest Natural has a pilot program that they're going to be talking about. I actually think I saw an email next week that I'm excited to listen into, because there's so much interesting stuff going on about a lot of these technologies and what can you do and what can't you do. And I think that's why with the scenario analysis, where we're able to toggle certain switches And then one thing that we're doing newer to this process that I'm really excited about is a much more qualitative and quantitative discussion about factors just like this. So when we present our scenario analysis and we have in our narrative of our IRP, say, scenario electrification, for instance, right? We'll be able to talk about some of the sensitivities that we end up toggling. And then hopefully, if we're able to execute what we want to, we'll be able to do a really good qualitative and quantitative analysis on both the assumptions that went into it, the rationale, the potential impacts of it. And I think that'll be good. And it also bleeds into energy efficiency, like you said. One thing we'll talk about in some of these scenarios is we are planning on having some toggles to energy efficiency based on specific scenarios. So for instance, if let's say we project that we may really need to ramp up energy efficiency. A good example would be if the RNG market didn't manifest to what we were hoping it would be, right? But we still have these compliance goals. Well, energy efficiency will presumably be a rather large tool towards hitting those compliance goals. So we would presumably need more energy efficiency. So we're preparing for that scenario by having our energy efficiency team do a higher CPA, for lack of a better term. And we talked a little bit about this during the last tag, where we present a different series of avoided cost, a higher avoided cost that they in turn can then produce a higher CPA. And then in that analysis, in that CPA, we're going to try to work with our energy efficiency folks, both in Bellingham and in with ETO, to try to have those conversations about, well, if the avoided costs were higher, potentially we could have now access to this resource. But what are the limitations with that resource? The technologically availability of it, the potential of it, how commercially accessible is it? Those are the kind of conversations that we want to have both qualitatively in the sense of having those exact, constraints, restrictions, hopes, qualitatively, and then quantitatively based on what we think we will be able to get out of it. This is what we think the actual therm impact will be. So that's kind of what I'm envisioning with that. I don't know what your thoughts are based on that.
Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, I think you're touching on all of the concerns that, I think we're trying to wrap our heads around, and I'm trying to wrap my head around. So yeah, look forward to digging in.
Awesome. Now let me see if I can do this request share thing. I'm trying to find the move forward button. I found it before in practice, but there it is. Thank you, Brian. All right. So scenario analysis. I'm just going to talk a little bit about that now. So we've introduced these scenarios in a prior tag, but now we kind of are starting to flesh out a little bit about what we want to do with these scenarios. So what exactly do some of these sensitivity toggles that we reference when we say things like scenario 2 CPA projected, or high RNG availability, or low RNG availability? I think we're ready to start talking about what that's going to actually mean in our modeling. So kind of as Brian mentioned, we have our base case and then 5 additional scenarios with 6 different sensitivities that can be toggled. And this is a dramatic difference from the way that we did our scenario and sensitivity modeling in the past. Some may say it was a little more scattershot. I know we got some really good feedback that we did a lot of different scenarios and sensitivities, which was great, but we didn't really spend a lot of time really digging into qualitative and quantitative discussions about what do the results of these scenarios mean. It's great to be able to just throw a bunch of numbers on a page, but it's really valuable to our stakeholders to be able to see, okay, we run this holistic carbon neutral by 2050 scenario, for instance. How do we interpret those results? What do they actually mean for both quantitative, what numbers are we looking at, but also qualitative? What expectations would we have if that ended up being how the future were to manifest in that scenario? So I think we're really excited about the potential to have that more in-depth analysis and discussion in the IRP. And what I want to do here is just kind of tee up these 6 scenarios, including the base case. And we do leave the door open still for other scenarios. As we kind of talked about before, it is a little late in the game, so it might be a little difficult to incorporate some scenarios if they were ambitious. But if there was something that a stakeholder thought would be really interesting, and if it's something we think there would be high value at trying to throw in this late in the game, we would certainly be willing to consider it. So please, that feedback is always welcome. But I'm going to go into some of these, what we have right now, and then if you have any questions about any of the assumptions, definitely let me know. don't know if I've lost control. Oh, whoop, sorry about that. Okay, so starting with our base case, the main elements of this is it's just our expected values for all sensitivities. This is kind of what Brian talked about when we say that expected case or kind of expected values. It's everything that's going to go into this base case. So our customer growth, for instance, that's just based off of our 2023 IRP load forecast that Ashton talked about in tab 2. Energy efficiency is going to be based on those CPAs that we've referred to from our own team in Washington and the Energy Trust in Oregon. The RNG availability, we've talked a little bit about this in prior tags, but that's going to be a weighted share of the high and technical blends of that 2019 AGF ICF study that we've referenced a couple of times in the past. I'm going to stop right now. Monica, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Dana. I'm so sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. Yes, the Washington energy efficiency will be based on the CPA. We are rerunning it though with these new avoided costs. So it's not going to be the exact numbers from that CPA. I just wanted to make that clarification since our timing was a little bit different from, let's say, how the electrics do it, with this being our first year on the new biennial conservation plan cycle. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. And actually, I'm happy you said that, Monica, because I think that's an important distinction that we wanted that actually applies for both Washington and Oregon. When we talk about CPA in the context of the IRP, it's really a tailored conservation potential assessment specifically towards what we're doing here. So Monica and her team have their biennial conservation plan with its own specific goals, its own conservation potential assessment associated with that, just as ETO has its own conservation potential assessment when it does its budgeting program. They look at more of a, I would say it's probably more of a Northwest Natural weighted share just because they are such a larger entity in Oregon. So that CPA is going to be more of a regional CPA, but when we reach out to them, we ask for a more specific CPA for us. And so the CPA that we get from the Energy Trust of Oregon, it's more of almost a theoretical CPA of a what would be our conservation potential with our inputs alone. So Monica brings up a good point that these CPAs are going to be really geared towards the most current inputs and analysis that we have. Yes, Kim.
Yeah, I don't know if you can say just a little bit more about, what your conversations with Energy Trust Oregon have been like in terms of capturing anticipated costs with the climate protection program in the cost effectiveness.
It's a great question.
Will it happen yet? I guess it hasn't happened yet, or do we expect there to be any update this year to reflect that?
So with Oregon, the one thing that we really try to follow the guidance of is the UM 1893 proceedings. I think Anna Kim does a great job of kind of leading that and introducing new elements and how should we be making changes and modifications based on that. So we're a little bit hesitant to go too far away from a lot of the things that are discussed in that. Northwest Natural brought up a really good point in one of their prior technical working groups that I think we agree with, that the fact that we include the social cost of carbon as an environmental compliance element in the avoided cost, and I'll get into avoided costs a little bit later in this slide deck, but we think that does a really good job of capturing the compliance with the Climate Commitment Act and the Climate Protection Program. The fact that we have that environmental compliance cost as the social cost of carbon, it does a really good job of emulating and capturing the impact of compliance with those programs. And that's just one element of it. So I think we're taking the stance and we're definitely open to talking about it during those UM 1893 proceedings to see if there is any appetite towards moving or potentially even evolving what the process might look like based on that compliance. But I think our stance right now, kind of similarly following Northwest Natural's lead on that in Oregon, is that by using the social cost of carbon in that environmental compliance element, we're kind of capturing a lot of those compliance with that regulation.
Excellent. Thanks, Devin.
Oh, awesome. Absolutely. So that's the energy efficiency element. We talked about RNG already a little bit, that it's that blend of that high and technical potential from the AGA ICF. We go aggressive on that just because that is a national study, and regionally we are probably going to be some of the most aggressive folks out there because we have the biggest appetite, or one of the biggest appetites, for renewable natural gas in the region versus some of the other areas of the country. So we think we're going to be able to capture that relatively higher share of it, at least in the base case. And we'll talk about how that may change over different scenarios as well. Hydrogen availability, it's based on that 20% supply by volume, which is about 7.8 or 7.5% by energy blend of hydrogen. This is a very hotly debated subject. We recognize that it's very, very challenging. I've heard as high as 30% could be safe. I've heard as low as 5% or not even any blending could be the potential amount that you could do for hydrogen. There's going to be, as we said, I'm excited that Northwest Natural is going to be doing a pilot that we're going to be following. There's going to be a lot of conversations that need to happen, a lot of testing even internally that we're going to want to do to make sure that we are ready for hydrogen. But the nice thing, depending on how you want to look at it about hydrogen, is it is somewhat of a future tech. There is some potential for hydrogen in the short term, absolutely, but with the pricing that we're seeing for hydrogen, I don't see it being a part of our short-term portfolio. I don't see it having any role in our action plan, for instance, our 2 to 4 year action plan. I just don't think that the pricing is going to make sense for hydrogen to be part of that at this point yet. So it's something we want to model because we do think there is going to be an impact of hydrogen, but we're also confident that it's not going to be a short term, so that we will have the ability in future IRPs to dynamically change these assumptions. And one thing we're going to do with this scenario analysis is evaluate what do some of those changes, some sensitivities of that, what does that look like for overall results. Natural gas bans, we're considering all expected bans as an element of the load forecast. The big one, since this is a Washington tag meeting, is obviously the actions happening in Bellingham. We're having some really good conversations with some of our business folks on getting an idea of what could be the impact based on the geographical locale of actual customers. What would be the impact if that had happened earlier, and then how could we potentially project that out moving forward? We're still pretty preliminary in that, so I'm not ready to talk too definitively about how that may be incorporated one way or another, but we're working on that, and that Bellingham one's going to be a big one that we're going to be working on in terms of expected bans. And then the price forecast, that comes off our 2023 IRP price forecast that I talked about in a prior session. We talked about the methodology of how we go ahead and do that. And that iteration was, I believe, memorialized and locked in May of this year, like May 23rd, I believe, is the iteration that we locked, which is a different subject altogether because, as those of you who have been following the markets have paid attention, there's been a dramatic fall, at least in the short-term pricing, because of an explosion of an LNG facility in Freeport. I believe that's down in the Houston area, and that has really shook the market. It's affected Henry Hub, and then that's had a chain reaction. I'm going to talk a little bit about why we don't think that's enough to change our long-term forecast in a couple of slides. But for now, we're monitoring it kind of in the spirit of this point in time restriction that we always talk about. We're monitoring it. We don't think it's material enough to cause an entire rerun of the price forecast, or rather a reinsertion of the price forecast and a rerun of all the modeling we've already done with that new forecast, but we're monitoring it. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Whoops, I did not mean to do that. Sorry, Brian, I'm trying to control your computer. Brian, do you want to just click through these slides for me? Because I think I'm causing more harm than good by trying to do what I'm trying to do. Great. Yeah. So our second scenario is going to be carbon neutral by 2050. So the main element of this scenario is going to be to have zero CO2 emissions by 2050, as per CCA CPP guidelines. And we throw that caveat in there because for at least this modeling exercise, we're going to allow the model to use and account for things like community climate investments and offsets and allowances, potentially, depending on where we end up landing on that. So when we say zero emissions, it's zero emissions, including some of those other elements potentially being as part of that zero emission goal. Customer growth, we're going to assume no changes in this particular scenario for. That will stay based on the IRP forecast. Energy efficiency would have to be presumably a higher output. You know, if we're going to have to get more aggressive on that carbon neutral goal, we're going to need to potentially invest more resources in energy efficiency. So we want to model a higher CPA using the commodity costs as the major change to that input. And kind of talking a little bit about what we settled on with that. I know we had a really good, robust discussion about that in the last TAG meeting. And we've ultimately decided to go with a hybrid approach based on RNG and green hydrogen costs, based specifically on what the deterministic model would end up taking of those resources in a given year. So for instance, if in the year 2025, 90% of the mix between green hydrogen and RNG is RNG and 10% of it were green hydrogen, then the blended price that would be used for that particular year would be 90% of the RNG price, 10% of the green hydrogen price. It's done on a monthly level too, so there's some extra blending that kind of happens with that, some load shaping. But it's basically that's the formula that's used to come across that new, for this particular sensitivity, that higher avoided cost that should theoretically lead to that higher CPA, which then in turn kind of leads to the ability to have those conversations about what is the sensitivity of the conservation potential, both quantitatively and qualitatively, getting into some of those risks that we talked about before about the technologies. For RNG availability, we're going to allow the model to go as high as the technical potential of the AGF ICF study. And this is also an important point. With all of these constraints, when we say it's going to be the weighted share of the technical potential, we're not saying that the model is going to 100% guaranteed use all of this. These are just the constraints that are part of this particular scenario. So the sensitivity constraint relating to RNG available is that it can go as high as that technical potential limit of those studies. And as we talked about in a prior one, we're not giving us access to all of that technical potential because that would be quite a bit of RNG and that would be quite ambitious of us. It's what we kind of derived as that, I'm just going to hate this term, but I'm going to use it, the Cascade share, or at least what we would potentially have allocated based on our size relative to national gas usage and how we compare as Cascade, the LDC, our percentage of total gas usage is going to be our share, for lack of a better term. We still have to go out there and earn it. We could theoretically even do better than that, but at the very least, that's what we would allocate as our potential share, as the cap, as the constraint of the amount of RNG availability. And then the model will size the resources that it deems appropriate each year in the planning horizon. Hydrogen availability. This one is where we're kind of pushing the limits a little bit on that. We're going up to 30% of expected supply by volume. I did go to a recent conference with some other local LDCs, or regional LDCs, I should say. There were some Canadian LDCs there as well. And we had these conversations about hydrogen blending. And some of the feel of it is that you could potentially go as high as 30%. And still be okay. Obviously, that's going to get even more and more risky. There's a lot more risk associated with that, with such a high amount of the blend. And that's kind of a qualitative risk that we would talk about in the narrative of it. But for this scenario, kind of assuming it's going to be an all hands on deck approach to get to carbon neutral by 2050, we want to give the model the ability to have access to that resource if needed. Natural gas bands, there's going to be no changes to that sensitivity. It'd be still all expected bands. For price, it's kind of interesting. So the geologic gas, the traditional gas forecast, we would assume actually a downward adjustment in that. The rationale being that for that, we're not going to be as aggressive in purchasing that resource. We're not going to need as much traditional gas because we have all these other resources coming in. And since we're not going to be as aggressive, we can be more judicious in our purchases, presumably. So presumably our cost would end up being slightly lower on that. RNG, however, as we talked about, if we're getting into the technical potential of RNG, the low-hanging fruit's gone. The mid-hanging fruit is gone. We're going to have to really try to access each and every program that we can if we want to be able to hit that carbon neutral goal. So kind of from a modeling perspective, you may remember that the way we've modeled RNG pricing is in tranches. So we had one tranche that was, I believe, $13.50, and then the other, I believe, is $18 per decatherm. Well, for this scenario, we're going to add a third tranche, that anything above, any resources above what we deterministically would say that we would need in that kind of base case modeling, any additional RNG would have to be at the highest tranche possible, which we're doing at $26 per decatherm. That number came about from some kind of conversations we had with others. I know in California, for instance, they do their review of RNG projects based on different tiers of kind of the degree of scrutiny a project gets. Anything above $26 gets the extreme scrutiny, and then I think 18 to 26 gets a mid-level of scrutiny. They have different tiers on it. So 26 is a number that I've seen from talking to some of other players who are more in the RNG market. 26 is really one of the higher prices I've seen for RNG. So we're going to use that as the cap. As if anything has to go into that above and beyond resource, it's going to be at a $26 tranche. So go into the next one. We want to model what happens if we have limited RNG availability. So the main component of this, as we talked about, what if technology kind of stagnates when it comes to RNG and all of a sudden there's a lot less available than we would initially hope. Additionally, let's say we need to take a conservative approach to hydrogen blending. As we're doing our analysis and internally kind of wondering about blending, let's say our corporate policies, we don't want to go above 5%. That's going to be a restriction for our modeling that we need to see how whatever this preferred portfolio or this candidate portfolio, we want to see how it would perform based on this constraint. So the customer growth would still stay the same. With less RNG, we definitely would need more energy efficiency, as I said above. So we're going to get into that higher energy efficiency. For RNG availability, we're going to use the low potential of the AGA-ICF study. It's a good quantitative source for us to use as to what if, hopefully we assume that to be the floor of RNG availability. We talked a little bit about the hydrogen availability restraint already. Gas bands would be the same. And geologic gas, we're going to assume no change to that. We also might consider a higher price of RNG. We haven't quite hammered this aspect out yet. We're still kind of debating it internally. But theoretically, if there is less available RNG, we might have to compete for it at a higher price. So that's one consideration we're going to make towards that modeling, and we'll discuss what we ultimately end up doing in the narrative of the IRP. Okay, so increased electrification, that's a scenario that I think is going to be really interesting to talk about a lot of these sensitivity analyses. So the main element of that is going to be lower than expected load projections due to both discretionary electrification and an increase on regulatory bands potentially. So customer growth, this is going to model one of the natural gas fact-finding trajectories that Oregon had us work on. We already had some load information on that, so we're able to use that. Customer growth would stay or gradually slow to 0% by 2025, and then afterwards it's going to reduce to 10% by 2050. So kind of slowly arcing towards 0 and then diving downward to customer counts going all the way down to 10%. Energy efficiency. For this, presumably a large portion or a potential portion of how this customer growth would change would be higher energy efficiency. So we're going to use a higher avoided cost. However, we've also had conversations with Monica's team and our consultants that we're also going to potentially incorporate lower customer counts into this scenario, more so related to some of the gas bands, I think. And so that will be interesting to see how these competing factors will play with each other, where it will be higher potential energy efficiency, but potentially lower customer counts. And we're still kind of working internally on how we're going to specifically model that. Yes, Monica.
Thanks, Devin. We've got the potential gas bands and then building code changes as well.
And building code changes, thank you.
That will have a significant impact on new construction. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you for clarifying that, Monica. RNG blend, we're not going to we would keep that toggle the same. No change to that sensitivity. Hydrogen would have no change to that sensitivity. And then the natural gas bands, we would be considering all expected and proposed bands. We'd really kind of be doing a more holistic analysis of things like the building code changes that Monica talked about, looking at other local municipalities and what bans they could potentially have, and how do we incorporate that into our modeling. And that'll allow for some good qualitative discussions about what are some of the things we're looking at there, and assuming those do come to fruition, ultimately what that would look like. Yes, Kim.
Thanks, Evan. I know this is primarily a Washington focused tag meeting, but in consideration of gas bans, are you in conversations with the city of Bend and their climate plan and how that does or does not interact? I know that I don't think that lives in there right now, but I'm curious to hear what you've heard from the city of Bend.
You stole my thunder for Oregon Tag 3.
Oh,
that was gonna be my big ace, as I talked about. It's yes. That is essentially going to be the equivalent conversation to the Bellingham bans for the Oregon Tag portion and the Oregon kind of portion as we start to potentially fork a little bit of these IRPs away from each other. The Oregon consideration is going to be really focusing on that Bend specific analysis.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And then natural gas, because once again, we're going to need less of that geologic gas because we're going to have less load presumably to serve in an electrification scenario. We're going to have that slight qualitative adjustment, qualitative perspective to a 10% quantitative adjustment to IRP to designate the fact that we can be more judicious in our purchases. Brian, next slide, please. High customer growth, kind of the other side of it. Once again, not trying to take a stance anyway, one way or another. I know this could be somewhat of a polarizing scenario to run, but it's important for us to do a full holistic analysis where, let's say, some electrification bans don't end up going, or electrification pushes don't end up going as some people think they might, but our growth continues to happen or even goes higher than we're expecting. That's going to be a challenge that we need to be prepared for, because we still want to make sure that we have the same emissions reduction requirements as in the CPP and the CCA. So that could be a challenge we want to make sure we at least have a scenario prepared for, and the corresponding qualitative and quantitative analysis with it. So customer growth would be based on a high growth projection that Ashton generated 23 load forecast. Energy efficiency, once again, we're going to have more load to serve on just a non-energy efficiency perspective. We're going to want to make sure we're using that higher energy efficiency from that higher commodity cost. RNG, we're going to need more RNG, especially because we have more growth but the same target. So we're going to use that technical potential and say we're going to get really aggressive with it, with that corresponding cost increase that we talked about in the price sensitivity. Hydrogen, once again, we're going to have to get aggressive with that potentially. So we're going to allow it to go up to 30%. Still considering the same gas bands. We don't want to change that. I think that's important. And an upward price adjustment on the price forecast, both for the geologic and for the RNG. Potentially, we're going to need to buy more gas, and we may not be able to have as much in the same way that we would have a benefit for being more judicious. We may have to be a little bit more aggressive in what we're buying on geologic gas. So we want to include that 10% adjustment in the price forecast. And then I think we have one more. This is going to be an interesting scenario. Interrupted supply with high price. So for those who have participated in our past tag meetings, you probably recall in prior years, you recall that we have run scenarios where we would include interruptions to Sumis supply, ACO supply, all of Canada supply, and Rockies supply. And we would run those each as their own sensitivities, and we'd get some good information for that, but it was really kind of hard to formulate a qualitative discussion about that, right? Truthfully, the way the world works is those aren't isolated incidents, but everything is kind of interrelated. If there's an explosion at Enbridge, for instance, which did happen, Sumis pricing would be impacted, but all other pricing would be impacted as well. So we wanted to really kind of look at a holistic analysis, a stochastically indiscriminately derived incident analysis. We have not fully fleshed this out yet, so I'm hesitant to go into too much detail on it, but in theory, something that we want to be able to do is put a stochastic check would happen on for a given year X, is there a incident that occurs? And if it does, prices end up spiking. It looks at where it is. We end up having prices spike to the stochastic high percentile across the board, because it could potentially have that holistic impact. And then in subsequent years, we end up seeing higher availability, because not only price spikes, but availability is going to be cut off, similar to what happened during that Enbridge incident, where we would not have the ability to buy gas or move gas from Sumas. And we're not just, I'm just picking on that because that's what I'm thinking of, but it could theoretically be anywhere, right? Something could happen in the Rockies. And once again, we say indiscriminate. We're not making any stance on any geopolitical reasons why it could happen, any economic reasons it could happen. It just happens, and we want to model it just happening without any real kind of editorializing as to why it would happen. So kind of it happens, the model says, at year X, something happens, right? Spike all the prices, drop all the availability, and then slowly start to ease more availability and ease pricing as time goes on, as is what happened once again in the past incidents, that over time, Enbridge was able to slowly add more availability, prices start to see recovery based on that, and eventually you get back to a normalized state until then you allow the model to keep doing random checks, and if something ends up popping off or triggering, for lack of a better term, you end up going through the process again, if and where it is. So that's kind of philosophically where that would end up being, and showing that relationship between high price and interrupted supply. We still need to figure out mechanically how we're going to do that. It's going to require, potentially some coding that's going to have to happen on through R to be able to create these new simulations. We don't want to commit too far to it. We may end up doing something else, but that's at least 30,000 foot potentially what I'm thinking for this kind of scenario. So how would that affect the toggle switches we're talking about? Customer growth would be, we have the high growth projection there. I'm not sure if that might be a typo. I think we were planning on doing the regular growth projections for that, but I'll double check on that. And if it is a typo, we can edit that in the slides that we ultimately end up finalizing. Energy efficiency would be based on our normal energy efficiency projected. RNG and hydrogen availability wouldn't change. Gas bands would be as expected. And then natural gas price would be that stochastic pricing that I just talked about. All right, and if there's nothing else, I think I'm kicking it over to Ashton to talk about some of these alternative resources.
Great, thanks, Devin. All right, I will go ahead, hit request control, I'll give this a go. I'll breeze through some of these slides. I know we're running up on some budget time issues, and Devin still has to talk a little bit about avoided costs. So I'll just talk about some kind of when we identify deficiency, what are the incremental options that we might give Plexos in order to choose, like to develop a solution for us, or at least point us in the right direction. So once a deficiency is identified, some sort of shortfall on our system, then Cascade has to look at all these different solutions. And so these can take place with conversations with various pipelines, storage facilities that we may use or we don't use, but we want to see if, give that Plexus the option to choose it if the rates are favorable. And then, of course, new supply sources. Emissions reduction planning is kind of another element that we're adding to this IRP. As Brian already mentioned, it's least cost, least risk, and now emissions and decarbonization. And Plexos is, of course, what is used to ultimately derive that optimal mix. I don't know where the button is.
Is it not working still?
Yeah, could you? Oh, okay. So this is was kind of a map that we actually made. We were getting kind of frustrated. There were a lot of maps out there that I just couldn't quite show what we wanted. So we ended up like tracing it and kind of creating a little cleaner map for our purposes. This just shows all of the pipelines, some that we use, some that we don't. Storages are in yellow. Basins are kind of those white circles. Just kind of shows everything. I'm going to zoom in on each part of these so you don't have to like memorize this map or anything. But if you go to the next slide, we'll kind of look at, I think, the north side. So this would be incremental transport that so remember, all of this is what we are giving Plexos the option to buy more of if it thinks that it is cost effective and worth it. So this would be incremental transport from the north to south. So this would be, you'll see we have GTN in blue, Foothills is that little purple, and then that green pipeline would be NGTL, which is Nova Gas Transmission Line. And those three kind of all have to work together, because if we're trying to get gas from ACO and any one of those contracts is bottlenecked, then it kind of nullifies, some of the capacity on the other pipelines, because we're limited to what can get through all three. And you may have heard in previous tags, we next year we have some contracts coming online to better align all three of those so that we can really utilize the maximum efficiency of our contracts. And that is essentially just getting that cheap ACO gas from the Alberta-BC border over to Kingsgate, which then moves down our GTN line and serves primarily Oregon. Go to the next slide here. So that was GTN, and then we're going to jump over on the left side, on the west side, the incremental transport on Northwest Pipe. So this could be, we might give Plexos the option to take more capacity along that I-5 corridor. We might let Plexos give them the option to look at a Wenatchee or Spokane lateral expansion to help serve some of the areas that we have, or some of the customers we have in central and eastern Washington. The Spokane lateral, of course, be up in the Spokane area. And then, of course, Eastern Oregon, as you see, Northwest Pipe travels down in a little bit, kind of hits that corner of Oregon. We also give it the option to, add capacity there if it needs to. And again, these are all options. We're not forcing anything. It's just, hey, if you want to take more, you can. You just got to let us know. That's kind of how we treat the modeling aspect of it. Now you can go ahead and go to the next slide here. So that was all from north to south. Now we're going to kind of jump on the south end of the system. This would be incremental Opal, which is just capacity to move gas from kind of that Utah area over into Opal, which would then flow across Ruby pipeline, which we have a contract on. It's not huge, but we do have a contract on. But we want Plexos to tell us if for some reason, in the future, it might be cheaper to sign up for a little bit bigger contract maybe and move gas over across Ruby to Malin and then up GTN. It kind of connects to the GTN right there at Malin. So just interesting, little puzzle pieces that we can do to try to really drive down the costs and move gas around and try to make it cheaper. And so that would, like I said, flow up GTN south to north. We can go to the next slide here. And then we have incremental transport kind of on that. You'll see that T-South Southern crossing, that orange line that kind of connects Sumas and Kingsgate in a way. That we would obviously allow Plexos to choose if it wanted. The idea behind that would be, Sumas gas, I'm sure everyone's aware, tends to be pretty expensive. It's really plentiful, but it's pretty expensive. So maybe there's a way that we could get that ACO gas over to Kingsgate and maybe over to Sumas and serve the I-5 corridor with some of that. We want to give that the option. Oftentimes, due to things like, rate pancakes, when you're traveling on 3 or 4 different pipelines, the rates really do add up. So that might nullify some of the savings, but we don't want to make any judgment calls. We want Plexos to do that for us. So we'll add that in there. And then things like, the Pacific Connector, a pipeline that, could have fed a LNG facility on the Oregon coast. We want to model things like that just to know how that would affect, our system. And we would assume that Malin's liquidity would be a lot higher. So maybe we could, shift some more gas from the south end of our system. But we can't know that without modeling it and taking the best modeling approaches that we can. Go ahead and jump to the next slide. And then, of course, incremental storage. As you know, the last couple of years we've picked up some more mist, but we are obviously always looking for storage. We don't own storage, but we are looking to lease it whenever it makes sense. So there's quite a few little storage things that we've found over in that Opal, kind of that Rockies region. Spire used to be Rickman Creek. There's Magnum. There's Clay Basin. They all have the different rates and the different capacities and things. There's ACO Hub up by ACO. So these are things that we would we would allow Plexos to choose, or previously send out, we would allow it to choose based off of as updated pricing and information as we can get. And then incremental storage, kind of like I had mentioned already with Mist. We also we didn't want to cross anything off the list arbitrarily. So although it might seem a little ridiculous, we did go down to California and find some, some storages that might be able to make their way up the puzzle pieces of the pipelines to our system, such as Wild Goose and Gill Ranch. We don't think they're necessarily going to make sense because, like I had mentioned, the rate pancake and how many different times you have to pay, transport to get up to us. But we're not trying to cross anything off the list arbitrarily. So we also add those in there with updated pricing and see if we can, save the customers any money with storage clear down in California. I mean, who knows? So those are kind of all the different things. We throw this all in the pot and let Plexos let us know what it thinks is cost effective and what's reasonable. And then I think this would be the last slide here, kind of breezing through, but I want to leave time for Devin. This zoomed out map here would just show things like if there's a specific RNG project or something, we can of course model it, directly on our system where it would be located, the exact capacity and things like that. But if we just want kind of a generic idea, we might say, all right, just anywhere on our system as far as RNG is concerned, and here's some prices. When and where would it make sense to directly put that into our system? Same thing with hydrogen is up-to-date information as we can get, and as much information as we can get, we'll give that to Plexos and try to allow it to at least point us in the right direction. It may not give us like an exact answer of what we need, but if it's for some reason telling us hydrogen on this part of our system is just super cost effective and plentiful, then maybe we just need to look in that direction. So some of this is just to at least point us in the right direction. It's not necessarily like the specific thing to do, but it all is just kind of goes with modeling. A lot of it is a guide and pointing us on what we need to do. And are there any questions for me that I could answer? If not, I'll be passing over to Devin, I believe.
All right. Thanks, Ashton. So yeah, first we're just going to do a little bit of a brief kind of tying a bow around the price forecast, giving an idea of some actuals that kind of take some of the concepts that we talked about in the last meeting. So these are what the final age dampened weights are. We can't specifically divulge which source it is, although we will provide them under confidential treatment in the actual IRP filing. But since this is a public meeting, we have to just outline them as source 1, source 2, source 3, source 4. And this kind of takes into account many of those mechanisms that we talked about, the interpolation of one source, kind of then adding the other sources interpolated in, and kind of that age dampening mechanism as well, to account for the fact that some sources may be older than others. You don't want to discount them entirely, but you do want to give some credence to some of the newer information you have. The result of that is in our next slide. The final price forecast. So yes, we did memorialize it as of May 23rd of 2022. Those of you who have been paying attention to the markets, once again, we do see something of an interesting challenge with the fact that the short-term prices have fallen somewhat dramatically. When we recorded this, January pricing was close to $11 at Sumas and even at Rockies. I think recently I've seen it around 8 in that short term. Definitely a significant movement, but one reason why we're staying away from making another change, a couple of things. First of all, we know specifically there's one major incident that's caused this price depression, and that's that Freeport LNG explosion. There's not a ton of information available about how soon that will be back online and what, if any, impact that could happen for that long-term pricing if it did come back online. So we don't want to make too dramatic of a decision based on that. Also, most of that impact is extremely short-term. The planning horizon doesn't even start until, I think, January of 2023. So for those first couple of months, it could have a slight impact, but we're really looking at a more macro perspective, a 27, 28 year analysis. So that micro adjustment, we don't think will be enough to have a material impact on the overall total planning horizon. That being said, we're still monitoring it. I check prices daily. Eric does a really good job also of letting us know when significant things happen. And so if something does happen that would trigger, a significant impact, let's say in a longer term, or even if short-term prices were to go down to $4-3, that might be something we'd want to consider. But prices are still elevated, even if they're not as high as they were, and factors could end up regressing back. So we're not planning on making a change yet, but we are heavily monitoring it. All right, so now I'm going to spend some time talking about our avoided cost. Something that we talked about is pretty vital input into that scenario analysis for energy efficiency. I've been working on avoided costs for a while now. I think it's a fascinating portion of IRP analysis, and it's the fact that there's no standardization about it. It's both beautiful and frustrating because there's so many different ways to do the same things that I think these conversations that can be had are great. So we're excited to kind of hear what people have to say about it. If there's any questions, thoughts, feedback, we're very excited to hear it. So kind of starting at the top philosophically, we do a 28-year price forecast now instead of just a 20-year price forecast to allow us to get those 45 years of avoided costs. And specifically, we want to focus on those costs up to 2050 because that's going to allow us to get as accurate as one can going out for a 28-year forecast, but as accurate as one can get for modeling what we think energy efficiency might be going into these emissions reduction goals that we're going to have. So what is the avoided cost? It's really the estimated cost to serve the next unit of demand with a supply side resource at an option in time. It's the counterweight to the costs associated with the energy efficiency programs that Monica and her team looks at, as well as ETO looks at. So if it's going to cost 50 cents per therm to install a more efficient water heater, I have no idea what the costs are, but let's say that was it. The avoided cost would need to be higher than that for that to be considered a cost-effective resource. With some caveats, there's kind of allowances for deviation between that buffer periods that allows for some deviation between that direct one-to-one. You can look at a more holistic portfolio analysis, I know. And then there's also certain measures that are exempt from that cost-effective analysis. But that's basically, it's the counterpoint to the energy efficiency analysis when you're trying to do that cost-benefit relationship. This incremental cost to serve represents the cost that could be avoided through energy conservation. It's a guideline. It's used to compare energy conservation with the cost of acquiring and transporting natural gas. So the real point of that is avoided costs. It's supposed to be soup to nuts from the minute the gas is purchased to the minute it is burnt at your or my house or for a business. Every step along the way, you want to capture all of those costs to create that huge holistic picture of what is the cost to serve, so that can be compared to the cost of energy efficiency. So as an overview, we're continuing to evolve this formula. A lot of things are going to be similar for those who have participated in our past IRPs. The two differences are funny enough, the two differences that we always seem to have: distribution costs and risk premium. We're continuing to try to find ways to evolve these methodologies, and we're really excited with what we're going to be presenting this year because we think we've made some really good steps towards getting a good, as close to an actual number for that, an accurate number as possible. Various elements will need to be reconsidered with regards to emissions reduction goals. So this kind of gets to that conversation we had that Kim brought up about, are we accounting for avoided costs in this new CCA CPP world? I think we are. I think we're kind of evaluating that, but as we continue to have these conversations, as we continue to participate in these proceedings, such as UM 1893, where as a group we have a chance to talk about this stuff, I'm excited to see if the industry will evolve with it, and if so, we'll be ready to evolve as such. We produced our avoided costs on peak day, and in the case of distribution system costs, it's peak hour, and that's an important consideration because distribution planning is done at an hourly level. So when we're coming up with a factor or a cost for distribution costs, not only do we want to account for how it performs on peak day, but particularly peak hour. and I'll get into a little bit of how we do that. Basically, what we do is we were very fortunate, actually, at the end of 2021, fortunate or unfortunate, depending on how you want to look at it. We had an extremely cold stretch in the region. I think it was like December 27th was one of the coldest days we've had in recent history, and it was one of our highest usage days in recent history. So we were able to pull representative data from our city gates from representatives city gate data. So we didn't want to overburden our gas supply team. So we said, let's grab kind of some of the bigger data points that we have in each of our conservation zones. So for Washington, we've got 3 conservation zones. One is on the west side. I think one is central and one is east, I think is how we have it. Or it might be like northwest and central. But we have 3 conservation zones, and we talk about it in the IRP what those zones are. And I think when we get into environmental, we talk about that when we have that presentation in our next tag. We have those 3 zones, and then our 4th zone is just Oregon altogether. And so we grabbed a representative sample from each of those zones, looked at what the coldest hour was on the cold peak day, and how did that compare to normal hourly usage. And that increase in usage is the peak hour factor that is used to kind of enhance the distribution system costs on the hourly level as well. So here's the formula. It may look a little bit intimidating, but it's really not. The nominal avoided cost, which you can convert to real dollars, and we do by just doing it by 1 over the discount rate to the number of years from your reference year, which I believe is 2021 from this iteration. But that cost is equal to your variable transportation costs. So that's on those transportation contracts that Brian and Ashton have been talking about. There's a cost to both reserve the capacity and then for every therm that you flow. We can't avoid the cost to reserve the capacity. We've reserved it. It's in place. It's going to be in place until the contract expires, but we can avoid not flowing on that contract. So that variable cost or that transportation cost is avoidable. Now, the fixed cost, one time that they are potentially avoidable is if we needed to acquire new capacity. So in Oregon, this is the upstream capacity element of the avoided cost workbook. And that basically looks at the projects that Ashton was just talking about. Let's say, I'm going to pick on the west side, for instance. Let's say up in Bellingham, we needed to be able to get, that's probably not the best example. Let's say in Bremerton, we needed to be able to get more transportation to that specific city gate from an upstream perspective. Let's say, and so we went out to Northwest Pipeline and we said, hey, we're going to need more capacity over there. And they would give us a quote for saying, okay, if you wanted to help build an expansion, this is what it would cost. This is what it would be on a per therm basis. If we thought we might need that potential cost for that expansion, both the fixed and the variable, would be an avoidable cost because it could theoretically be avoidable or at least deferred. And that deferred term is one I want people to really think about because that's a major element of the distribution system cost. But it could at least be deferred. And anytime you can defer a project, there's a value in that, mainly from the time value of money, right? Things that are spending money in the future is more ideal than spending money today, because if you had the money today, you could invest it, you could get whatever your rate of return is on it, and then use that extra money in the future. So you always want to try to spend money in the future. So that defer value has value. And that's what theoretically could be done with the avoided cost. Storage costs, the variable costs are only really avoidable, once again, if it's, or only included if it's avoidable, right? Storage is a weird one because for Cascade, we don't have any on-system storage. So for those of you who are more familiar with Northwest Natural, and they have their MIST facility, which is where they are able to kind of take gas from that and put it right into their Portland distribution system, we don't have that luxury. So storage for us is mostly just a price arbitrage and a peaking resource. So from an avoid cost perspective, it typically doesn't come into play. The exception would be if we were to need to build an on-system storage facility for whatever reason. If over here in my backyard in Pasco, all of a sudden we had this great opportunity to build a storage facility, there could be some avoided cost with that because it would hook right into our distribution system. We don't have that though, so in every element of avoided cost that I've at least been a part of, that value's been 0. Commodity cost comes from our price forecast, except when we're doing those sensitivity analysis, in which case it may come from those other elements that we talked about. Environmental compliance costs, we already kind of talked a little bit about. That's the social cost of carbon, and that's meant to capture that element of it, that cost of compliance with it, that one resource. As an analog, we use social cost of carbon. Distribution system costs and risk premium, I'm going to put in a pin for now because I'm going to talk about that in a lot more detail in later slides. And then all of that is multiplied by the environmental adder, which is a 10% kind of bump to everything as recommended by the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. And we have followed industry kind of standards, talking to what others have been doing, and get some great feedback from some of our stakeholders. And we now apply that to our entire avoided costs instead of just some elements of it. So what is not changed? This should be nice and easy. Our variable transportation costs, those are still pulled directly from those major pipelines that we talked about earlier. The fixed costs are only included when they are avoidable. Talked about what that was about, talked about storage, only if it's avoidable. Commodity costs come from our price forecast. The environmental compliance cost is that social cost of carbon, which is scaled to real 2021 dollars. Now the environmental adder is added to all elements, and it's that 10% as per Northwest Power and Conservation Council guidelines. So let's talk about distribution costs for a little bit. So in the past, for those who have been participants in our process, we would use margin as the analog for distribution costs. With the logic being that the margin portion of our tariff would account on a per therm basis to some extent for those expected future growth costs. We've talked with actually our sister company, IGC. We've had some really great conversations with some of the analysts over there with some of the things that they're doing. Talked with some of the other regional players as well, like Northwest Natural. And we've decided to kind of move away from that and really only look at those capital expenses, which should theoretically be a part of the margin anyway. But let's try to go exactly to the source of it. Those capital expenses specifically related to growth. So we've got our capital budget. We back out things that are like system integrity, things that are unavoidable expansions, or not even expansions. Integrity is really the best one. MAOP stuff, and really only look at growth-related items. And then we also look at the load forecast to see what our expected peak day growth is. And taking that peak day growth in a per therm basis plus the growth-related cost, we should be able to get a dollar per therm figure for avoided distribution costs. But now one thing that's really important to realize is very rarely are you going to ever be able to fully remove the need for a distribution system enhancement. Let's say I'll use Bend because that's one that we have quite popular right now, even though this is the Washington presentation, but we have a lot of projects in Bend. Even with energy efficiency, the need is rather significant. So you may be able to theoretically push back a year or two, but you're still ultimately going to continue to have a lot of growth. In those large growth areas, you still do need to be able to, theoretically at least, eventually be able to handle all that growth. However, there is that value for deferring the need to do it. If I can avoid doing it today and instead do it in 2024 or 2025, there's that time value of money, that economic principle of it, that this deferral has value. If I could then take the $5 million that I would put towards an investment, get whatever my rate of return is on it, so let's say 8%, and then 3 years from now do that project, that $5 million is now, as I try to do quick mental math, $5.4 million. That $5 million is now $5.4 million. So all of a sudden now I have, by deferring it 5 years, I have an extra pool of money towards it. So there's value in that. We've saved $400,000. All those equal using real dollars versus nominal dollars. So we want to capture that value. That's an oversimplification. We want to capture that value, whatever it might be on a per therm basis. That's the whole principle. And I've got some slides that show graphically what it is exactly we're trying to do. Now, since it's based on peak day, it's multiplied by the ratio of peak day to an average day demand, because everything we've talked about is just kind of doing it on an average day basis, but being able to defer on peak day is more valuable because that's ultimately where the deferral is going to end up happening. Same thing with peak hour, because distribution costs happen on an hourly basis or on an hourly analysis. The peak hour difference adds extra value to it. And so that is incorporated in the calculation. I think I've got a little bit of a visual to explain this deferral capacity value, though. So here's a very simple example of what capacity modeling has looked like in the past, right? So we've got our peak day load, the ascending arrow, and we've got what our initial capacity is. If you go to the next slide, Brian, at that intersection point is where we're going to see that point of deficit. From that time onwards, we're not going to have enough capacity. This is for a given city gate. Let's use Pasco because I live here. For Pasco, let's say we don't have enough capacity to serve what we expect our peak load to be. So in the past, what usually would be considered is increasing that capacity. So Brian, if you go ahead and go to the next slide, one option you could do is upgrade your capacity. You see that point of deficit has been moved out over time a little bit. But there's another thing that we can do, and that's bringing down your forecast peak load. And this has really been a big push in the region, is looking at this as a potential resource. And so what we're kind of trying to do in the avoided distribution costs is capture what that value would be. So in the next slide, the other option is to look at that reduced peak demand, peak day load. So that's going to be that green arrow. By reducing what peak day load is, all of a sudden we have a delayed point of deficit. Getting back to that principle we talked about earlier, by being able to invest in that project 5 years from today, there's value in that, and we want to quantify that value. Now, one principle that's also important to note is the slope of your growth does impact that value. Going to the next slide, if we had a lower slope growth, then by making that same deferral, maybe we go out instead of 5 years, maybe we can defer out up to 10 years. So now, using that same time value of money principle, there's even more value in being able to defer with that lower growth. And that's something we want to try to capitalize and make sure that we're quantifying. So in terms of dollars, what does it really kind of look like, at least from a theoretical perspective? I don't want to get into actual dollars just yet. We'll discuss that in the narrative. The next slide should go over that a little bit. So let's talk about the cost of capacity enhancement, right? So you got your current day cost to, if you were to just do it today, and that's going to be the black bar. And then let's say you wait until you actually hit the point of deficit. That's going to be the teal bar. And why is that higher? So it's nominal dollars we're talking here, right? So inflation will probably have an impact on that. Costs of goods are going to have an impact on that. It may be more expensive in the future from using actual dollars that you pay for it to do that project. Delaying it even further in the future is going to compound that effect a little bit more. Inflation is going to have a further impact on it. So from a nominal perspective, you would think, oh, it makes sense to do it at current day because it's going to be the cheapest to do it. However, when you make that time value of money adjustment to real dollars, you'll see what actually happens is the costs go down. By looking at using our rate of return to capture that value, we're able to get a lower cost in the future for doing it because we can use that money and get a rate of return on it, presumably. That's going to be the value that we're looking at. So if you go to the next slide, the difference between the cost at the point of deficit versus at the delayed deficit, that's the present value of deferral that we want to ultimately utilize in our avoid cost model for distribution costs. I think that's on distribution costs. I think that's everything. If there's no questions, I can move on to our new risk premium analysis. Okay, seeing nothing. So for risk premium now, we've made another change to this that I'm actually really excited about. In the past, our risk premium has always been either 0 or negative. So one thing we did in the past is we reached out to our AMA partner and we said, hey, can you give us a theoretical quote to fully hedge our entire portfolio for the entire planning horizon? That's not realistic. They were willing to do it, but it was a non-binding quote. Nobody would ever make that kind of a risk investment. It's way too risky. So we've decided to change it up a little bit. And this actually follows something similar to what Northwest Natural is doing, but we've kind of changed our philosophy a little bit on it from theirs. So we're defining risk premium for this IRP as the difference between the impacts of an extreme upward price movement versus that of an extreme downward price movement. And Brian, I'm going to have you move on to the next slide because I think there's a visual that will help people understand that. So a quick kind of reminder for those on the difference between normal and log normal distributions, because this is a critical element in why this works. So prices, natural gas prices are empirically known to be log normally distributed. The returns are normally distributed, but the prices themselves are log normally distributed. Well, why is this important? Well, if they were normally distributed, the neon green bar would tell you that the difference in an upward movement and a extreme upward movement and extreme low movement, if you take the average of that, it's going to match exactly with your deterministic or mean value. That's the beauty of a normal distribution. That's what allows for a lot of the analysis based on normal distributions to happen, actually happens. With log normal distributions, however, it works a little bit differently. You're going to have more of the data points concentrated on the low end, but the extreme prices are going to go a lot higher. So therefore, if you look at the 99th percentile versus the first percentile of a log normal distribution, more often than not, what you're going to end up seeing is this awesome difference in that the higher versus the higher lower average is going to be higher than your deterministic or your expected mean value. That difference in value is what we're able to capture as the risk premium. And I have some more examples of that, but Brian, you can go back to the last slide now. So due to that log normal nature of stochastic prices, the risk presented from rising prices is higher than that of falling prices. And by risk of falling prices, I mean if you were to hedge and prices fall, you do have a potential loss for that. While if you're unhedged, and energy efficiency can be looked at a hedge for this perspective, but if you're exposed to prices, the higher prices are more of a risk. So this analysis is used in a risk-adjusted price calculation. And this is the second time you've heard us mention that risk-adjusted term. That's kind of our philosophy on when we're trying to do risk-based quantitative analysis. Similar to what Northwest Natural does, what we do is 75% of the deterministic results are weighted as such, and 25% of the stochastic results. It's a qualitative adjustment. We've been doing it for a couple of years. We like that it still weighs more heavily towards what you expect to happen, but still gives credence to that unexpected what if. So we do that similar process in that risk-adjusted price analysis calculation. And so that's done to calculate the final risk premium. So Brian, you can go forward 2 slides. So here's an actual example. What I did was I took our stochastic SUMIS pricing, and this was for just one particular month. So this was of November of 2023, and 10,000 draws. So we took 10,000 draws of SUMIS pricing based on the variance that we enter in, the expected pricing is correlated to the other basins, and we say, what are our stochastic prices? And so here's the result of it. So you can see it has that similar shape where you have more data points kind of concentrated on the left tail, but the extremes are a lot higher on the right side. The lowest it really gets is pretty much 0. There were a couple that went to the negative, which is a different can of worms altogether. Mostly we can ignore those because they're black swans essentially, right? They're so far out in the ranking of the 10,000. Maybe there's 10 draws out of 10,000 that are in the negative or something like that. Those can be considered black swan events, just in the same way that anything more than 15 or 16, the 16 is probably a black swan event as well. But if we take the high-low averages of the 99th percentile and the first percentile, we end up getting a $6.07 per dectherm for this one particular sample set. The deterministic price input for that was the $3.56 per decatherm. And that gap between the two is going to be the stochastic element of the risk premium that is then thrown into that risk-adjusted calculation. So Brian, go on to the next slide. So the final calculation is basically we take that deterministic price, multiply it by 75%, and then we take the average of the 99th percentile and the first percentile price, weigh that by 25%. Then we take this risk-adjusted element, minus it by what we expect the price is, and that difference is going to ultimately be what our risk premium is. We really like this. It captures the difference between expected pricing and a blend of deterministic and stochastic pricing. It's consistent with some of our other processes, as we talked about, as Brian had mentioned earlier. We use the same or similar risk-adjusted methodology when we're doing our portfolio analyses for both serving demand, total system cost, and environmental compliance. We're going to use it for as well. And one thing I really like about this is it captures the increased uncertainty around pricing. You'll actually see on the next slide, our risk premium in the short term it's very slightly negative. We just zero that out for this purpose. It's basically just because there's not enough short-term variance that's going to create enough of a risk premium. So we just zero that out. But as we go forward in time, you see the risk premium continues to increase. That reflects what you would expect to happen in the real world. Now, there is some noise around that. Obviously, there's going to be dips and valleys, but overall, the trend is an increase in risk premium over time. That's what you should expect to happen. As you're going further into the future, there's more uncertainty about it. So the value of energy efficiency, which is theoretically a certain defined value, is more valuable than the uncertainty that you're exposed to with markets. So this is, I believe, our draft avoided cost risk premium. Once again, those early values are going to be zeroed out, but this is the first time that we're actually going to be including a value for risk premium in our avoided costs instead of it just being 0. And we feel really comfortable with these values. We feel confident that they actually more accurately reflect what the avoided cost is versus what we've done in the past, whether methodologically or the actual values. And I think at 12 o'clock, that's just about everything in conclusion, we're continuing to enhance our process with these distribution cost and risk premium calculations. And we've provided these avoided costs to our energy efficiency team, who will be sending back those conservation potential assessments based on these inputs. Okay, now at 12, exactly on the dot, I think I've finished.
Yeah. Thanks, Devin. Are there any questions on avoided costs before we wrap up this meeting? Okay. I don't hear any questions. So to go over the remaining schedule, we'll have Tag 3 Oregon, July 14th. We'll be discussing a lot of the same details here. We'll gear it a little more towards Oregon for that presentation. Then we have Tag 4 Washington on August 10th and Tag 4 Oregon on September 20th. And just to give everyone a little bit of a heads up, since we moved distribution system planning to Tag 4, we may be looking at making those meetings a little longer. So we may be taking a lunch break and then extending into the afternoon on those dates. And then we'll jump into Tag 5, Washington, Oregon. This is where we'll talk about final results. Tag 5 Washington, September 28th, and Tag 5 Oregon is November 9th. We'll distribute the Washington IRP November 24th and the Oregon IRP on January 5th. And then we'll ask for stakeholder comments. We're giving about 6 weeks for those, 6 to 7 weeks. And we'll hold a Tag 6 if needed. If there's anything that stakeholders want us to present on further, we have some dedicated dates for those. In the past, we've had times where we don't need the meetings. And then there's times where we have an hour-long meeting just to discuss one topic. And then we will be filing the IRPs. Washington will be filed February 24th, 2023, and Oregon will be filed April 14th. So just to review real quick, the plans for Tag 4, Tag 4 Washington, it will be distribution system planning, carbon impacts, energy efficiency, renewable natural gas, and then preliminary resource integration results. At this time, I'd like to open it up for questions we like to leave the little bit of time at the end of the presentation. If there's questions, feel free to come off mute. Send us a chat question. If there are no questions, we can wrap up, and I'll give it about 10 seconds, 15 seconds. Okay, I'm not hearing any questions. If anyone comes up with questions later, feel free to reach out and, oh, I see a question now. Yeah, Abe asked if I could add him to the tag list for Washington. I believe the distribution list for Washington and Oregon are the same. So if you don't have, yeah, definitely we can look at doing a 10-minute break. If you don't have the Washington meetings or any of the Oregon meetings on your schedule, please reach out to me, and I can forward those meeting invites to you. But the list is the same, so if you have the Oregon meetings, I believe you should have Washington. Okay, just a reminder, here's some contact information for our resource planning team. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We also have this IRP at cngc.com that all of us have access to. And so reach out if you have any questions, any comments, any suggestions. With that said, thanks everyone for joining our Tag 3 meeting, and we look forward to, if you join our Oregon Tag 3 meeting, we look forward to talking to you then, or we'll see you at the next Tag 4 Washington meeting. Thanks everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.